Committee who raised real concern about individuals being persecuted for their faith in Iran. Can the Foreign Secretary ensure that in every discussion we have with our Iranian counterparts, that religious freedom is made a key priority so as individuals can practice their faith freely?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. I welcome to him his role as PM Special Envoy in this area. I know he'll do an amazing job with all his dynamism and knowledge in the area, and he's absolutely right to say that we should be raising the issue on human rights, not just in relation to dual nationals, but also the persecuted minorities and people of faith in Iran itself.
Mr. Speaker, given that the Stena Imperial's headquarters are found in my constituency, it would be remiss of me to say that I do not dispute the Secretary of State's assertion that Iran are culpable in terms of these attacks. And I welcome the work that his government has done to construct a bridge between the United States and Europe. Nevertheless, given the United States is fixated on regime change in Iran, can the Secretary of State today give an unequivocal commitment to détente with Iran and the re-establishing of this 2015 nuclear-free framework?
Well, the honourable gentleman puts it in his own way. What I would say is we need to have clear consequences for the violations of international law that Iran engages in. We need to bring the broadest international support to make those measures effective, but we do also need to de-escalate and create the space and the route and the roadmap for Iran to come in from out of the international cold.
Dr. Matthew Alford.
Speaker, it's 4 years since the JCPOA was implemented, and many of us were very much against it at that time. But since that occasion, we've seen Iran become more belligerent, not only engaging in attacks against our nationals, but also harassing our fleets and transport. And engaging in cyber attacks, even against this Parliament itself. Does the Foreign Secretary really believe this is a country that wants to engage with the international community?
The honourable friend makes the point very powerfully. Iran is giving the international community, certainly the United Kingdom, and in relation to the Grace 1 episode, the very clear message that it doesn't live up to its word. If Iran wants a path to international respectability and the prosperity that comes with it, it's going to have to reverse those actions, live up to its responsibility, and then there is a possibility for it.
Thank you. Order. Statement. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They want a change, Mr. Speaker. They want a change of government, Mr. Speaker. Let them have an election. Now, with your permission, I shall make a statement on yesterday's Supreme Court verdict.
There'll be ample opportunity for everybody who wants to question the Prime Minister in conformity with usual practice to do so, but the statement must and will be heard. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I shall make a statement on yesterday's Supreme Court verdict and the way forward for this paralysed Parliament. 3 years ago, more people voted to leave the European Union than have ever voted for any party or proposition in our history. Politicians of all parties promised the public that they would honour the result. Sadly, many have since done all they could to abandon those promises and to overturn that democratic vote. And after 3 years of dither and delay that left this country at risk of being locked forever in the orbit of the EU, this government that I lead has been trying truly to get us out. And most people, indeed most supporters of the party opposite, regardless of how they voted 3 years ago, think the referendum must be respected. They want Brexit done. I want Brexit done, and people want us out on October the 31st with a new deal if possible, but without one if necessary. Now, 64 days ago, I was told that Brussels would never reopen the withdrawal agreement. We are now discussing a reopened withdrawal agreement in the negotiations. I was told that Brussels would never consider alternatives to the backstop, the trap that keeps the UK effectively in the EU but with no say. We're now discussing those alternatives in the negotiations. I was told Brussels would never consider arrangements that were not permanent. We're now discussing in the negotiations an arrangement that works on the principle of consent and is not permanent. I was told there was no chance of a New Deal, but we are discussing a New Deal. And this is in spite of the best efforts of the party opposite and this Parliament to wreck our negotiations by their attempts to take no deal off the table. The truth is that the majority in this Parliament, the majority opposite, are not opposed to the so-called no deal. This Parliament does not want Brexit to happen at all. And many of those who voted for the Surrender Act a few weeks ago said then that their intention was to stop a no-deal Brexit. They have said every day since that Parliament must vote against any deal at all. I think the people of this country can see very clearly what is going on. The people at home know that this...
Order! Order! People are gesticulating wildly. I can scarcely hear the Prime Minister myself, and I wish to hear the statement, as other colleagues should also do. The Prime Minister would...
The people of this country can see perfectly clearly what is going on. They know that Parliament does not want to honour its promises to respect the referendum. The people at home know that this Parliament will keep delaying, it will keep sabotaging the negotiations because they don't want a deal. Mr. Speaker, the truth is that members opposite are living in a fantasy world. They really imagine that somehow they are going to cancel. This is what they want to do. They're going to cancel the first referendum. They're going to legislate for a second referendum. And Parliament will promise that this time, perhaps not the lady opposite, but Parliament will promise that this time it really, really will respect that vote. And they think that the public will therefore vote to remain and everybody will forget the last few years. Mr. Speaker, I have to say I think that is an extraordinary delusion and a fantasy even greater than the communist fantasies peddled by the Leader of the Opposition. It will not happen. The public don't want another referendum. What they want and what they demand is that we honour the promise we made to the voters to respect the first referendum. And they also want us to move on, to put Brexit behind us and focus on the NHS, on violent crime, and on cutting the cost of living. And that is why I brought forward a Queen's speech. This government intends to present a programme for life after Brexit. But some members of this House could not stand that either. Instead of facing the voters, the opposition turned tail and fled from an election. Instead of deciding to let the voters decide, they ran to the courts instead. And despite the fact that I followed the exact same process as my predecessors in calling a Queen's speech, the Supreme Court was asked to intervene in this process for the first time ever, and it is absolutely no disrespect to the judiciary to say I think the court was wrong to pronounce on what is essentially a political question at a time.
Order! Whatever the strength and intensity of feeling and the passions to which these matters give rise, we must hear what is being said in the chamber, and I wish to hear the Prime Minister.
The court was wrong to pronounce on what is essentially a political question at a time of great national controversy. So we have opposition MPs that block and delay everything, running to the courts to block and delay even more, including blocking legislation to improve and invest in our NHS and keeping violent criminals in jail. And I think the people outside this House understand what is happening. They know that nothing can disguise the truth. It's not just that this Parliament is gridlocked, paralysed, and refusing to deliver on the priorities of the people. It's not just unable to move forward, it's worse than that, Mr. Speaker. Out of sheer selfishness and political cowardice, members opposite are unwilling to move aside and give the people a say. They see MPs demanding that the people should be given a say one week and then running away from the election that would provide the people with a say. And worst of all, they see ever more elaborate legal and political manoeuvres from the party opposite, which is absolutely determined to say, we know best, and thumb their noses at the 17.4 million people who voted to leave the European Union. The leader of the opposition and his party do not trust the people. The leader of the opposition and his party are determined to throw out the referendum result, whatever the cost. They don't care, Mr. Speaker, about the bill for hundreds of millions of pounds that will come with every week of delay. They don't care if another year or more is wasted in arguing about a referendum that happened 3 years ago. All that matters to them now is an obsessive desire to overrule the referendum result. While we want to take our country up a gear, to go forward with a fantastic programme, an accelerated programme of investment in infrastructure, in health and education and technology, they are throwing on the handbrake. Well, Mr. Speaker, we will not betray the people who sent us here. That's what they want to do. We will not abandon the priorities that matter to the public. And we will continue to challenge those opposition parties to uphold democracy. If honourable and right honourable members opposite so disagreed with this government's commitment to leaving on October the 31st, they had a very simple remedy at their disposal, did they not? They could have voted for a general election. I have to confess, Mr. Speaker, that I was a little shocked to discover that the party whose members stood up in Brighton this week and repeatedly and in the most strident terms demanded an election, I heard them, is the very same party whose members already twice this month, not once but twice, refused to allow the people to decide on their next government. For 2 years they have demanded an election, but twice they have voted against it. The leader of the opposition changes his mind so often. I wonder whether he supports an election today or whether the shadow chancellor or the shadow attorney general have overruled him again, because they know that the voters will judge their manifesto for what it is: more pointless delay. Is he going to demand, perhaps he's going to demand an election and then vote against it? Just as he said he wants to negotiate a new Brexit deal and then vote against that too. Is he actually going to vote no confidence in this government? Is he going to dodge a vote of no confidence in me as Prime Minister in order to escape the verdict of the voters? I wonder, does he in his heart even want to be Prime Minister anymore? He says that I should go to Brussels on 17th of October and negotiate another pointless delay, but he doesn't want to go himself. And even if he did, his colleagues wouldn't let him, because quite frankly they recoil. They recoil at the idea of him negotiating on the people's behalf, representing this country with the likes of Vladimir Putin, let alone the EU or the mullahs of Tehran. Or is it perhaps that he wants a Conservative government? It would be a curious state of affairs indeed if Her Majesty's loyal opposition had every faith in the government of the day. So if in fact the party opposite does not have confidence in the government, they will have a chance to prove it. They have until the House rises. Let them listen. I think they should listen to this, Mr. Speaker. They have until the House rises today to table a motion of no confidence in the government. Come on then. And we can have that vote tomorrow. Or if any of the other parties, the smaller parties, fancy a go, they can table that motion and we'll give you the time for a vote. Will they have the courage to act, or will they refuse to take responsibility and do nothing but dither and delay? Why wouldn't they? What are they scared of, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, it is now well over. If that's what you're scared of, then have an election.
Order. I appeal to the House to have some regard to how our proceedings are viewed by people watching them in the country at large. Order! Let the remainder of the statement be heard. I'm grateful for the Prime Minister's exhortation, but I don't require it. I'm perfectly content. What I want to hear is the rest of the statement and then questioning on it. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you. And as I commend this statement to the House, I say it is time to get Brexit done. Get Brexit done so we respect the referendum. Get Brexit done so we can move on to deal with the people's priorities, the NHS, the cost of living. Let's get Brexit done so we can start to reunite this country after the divisions of the referendum, rather than having another one. It's time for this Parliament, finally, to take responsibility for its decisions. We decided to call that referendum. We promised time and again to respect it. I think the people of this country have had enough of it. This Parliament must either stand aside and let this government get Brexit done, or bring a vote of confidence and finally face the day of reckoning with the voters. And I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. Unfortunately, it was like his illegal shutting down of Parliament. Null, of no effect, and should be quashed. In the words of the Supreme Court. This, Mr. Speaker, was 10 minutes of bluster from a dangerous Prime Minister who thinks he is above the law. But in truth, Mr. Speaker, is not fit for the office which he holds. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to see so many colleagues back here doing what they were elected to do, holding the government to account for its failings. Whether it's the attempts to shut down democracy, its sham Brexit negotiations, its chaotic and inadequate no-deal preparations, its allegations of corruption, its failure on climate change, its failure to step in to save Thomas Cook, This government, Mr. Speaker, is failing the people of Britain, and the people of Britain know it.
Order! I said that the Prime Minister shouldn't be shouted down. The same goes for the Leader of the Opposition. And let me say to people bellowing from a sedentary position, stop it. You will exhaust your vocal cords. You will get nowhere. It won't work. And these proceedings will continue for as long as is necessary for the Chair to be satisfied that proper scrutiny has taken place. It is as simple and incontrovertible as that. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday's Supreme Court verdict represents an extraordinary and, I believe, precarious moment in this country's history. The highest court in this land has found the Prime Minister broke the law when he tried to to shut down our democratic accountability at a crucial moment in our public life. The judges concluded there was no reason, and I quote, let alone a good reason, for the Prime Minister to have shut down Parliament. After yesterday's ruling, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister should have done the honourable thing and resigned. Yet, Mr. Speaker, here he is, forced back to this House to rightfully face the scrutiny he tried to avoid. With no shred of remorse or humility, and, of course, no substance whatsoever.
That's right.
So let's see if he will answer some questions.
He won't. He won't.
Does the Prime Minister agree with his Attorney General
Write it down, Boris.
that the government got it wrong, or with the Leader of the House that the Supreme Court committed a constitutional coup? This, Mr. Speaker, is a vital question about whether the government respects the judiciary or not. The Attorney General was also categorical that the government would comply with the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act. Can the Prime Minister confirm that? Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to those MPs from all parties across the House, the Lords and in the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, who have not only fought so hard to stop a disastrous no deal, but continued to take the case against prorogation through the courts. The government has failed to silence our democracy. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, during the period of unlawful prorogation, the government was forced to release their Yellowhammer no-deal analysis and plans. No wonder the Prime Minister has been so eager to avoid scrutiny and so eager to hide the dangers of his Brexit plan. The release of those documents leads to many questions the government must now answer that our Parliament is back in operation. So I would like to start by asking the Prime Minister why Mr. Speaker, by asking the Prime Minister why the government described leaked Yellowhammer documents in August as being out of date. When the documents were later produced in September, they were word for word the same documents. It is clear they have tried to hide from the people the truth, the real truth of a no-deal Brexit, and tried to hide the fact that their policy would heap misery on the people of this country. Let's just take a look at the analysis. Chaos at Britain's ports with months of disruption. People going short of fuel and fresh foods.
Your paper?
It's your paper, you wrote it, you tried to hide it. I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker, I don't hold you responsible for writing the document. disruption of people's vital medical supplies, rises in energy prices for every household in the whole country, a hard border for the people of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Most damning of all, Mr. Speaker, is the passage that simply says, and I quote, "Low-income groups will be disproportionately affected." Well, there we have it, Mr. Speaker. A simple warning, a simple truth, that a Tory government is continuing to follow a policy they will know will hit the poorest people in our country the hardest. They simply do not care. Mr. Speaker, the damning document we have already seen is only 6 pages long. It's only right that this House should expect more transparency from this government. The government says they're doing all they can to get a deal before October the 31st. But the truth, Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister has hardly put any effort into negotiations, any progress at all, looks at its most generous best to be minimal. Only yesterday, the European Union's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, said that there was no reason today for optimism. Can I ask the Prime Minister why he believes Mr. Barnier has that view? This House is still yet to hear any detail of any deal the government seeks to negotiate. We're told the government has distributed papers to Brussels outlining proposals for a change to the backstop. Will the Prime Minister publish these papers and allow them to be debated in this House of Parliament? For this government to have any credibility with our people, they need to show they have an actual plan. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister also has questions to answer about his conduct in public office. And in particular, allegations that he failed to declare an interest in the allocation of public money to a close friend whilst he was Mayor of London. It was announced today that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is reviewing the funds allocated in the light of the Sunday Times report. Did the Prime Minister initiate that review? Will the Prime Minister fully cooperate with the DCMS review and that of the Greater London Assembly? Will he refer himself to the Cabinet Secretary for investigation? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, no Prime Minister, is not above the law. Mr. Speaker, no one can trust this Prime Minister, not on Iran, not on Thomas Cook, not on climate change, not on Brexit.
Iran, yes, on Iran.
For the good of this country, Mr. Speaker,
Order. The Leader of the Opposition is entitled to be heard in this Parliament. Order. And he will be heard. I don't mind how long it takes. These exchanges will take place in an orderly manner. Be in no doubt about that. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quite simply, for the good of this country, he should go. Mr. Speaker, he says he wants a general election. I want a general election. It's very simple. If you want an election, If he wants an election, get an extension and let's have an election.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman asked several questions. I'll try and deal with them in order. On the first point, my friend the Attorney General made absolutely clear, of course, that this is a judgment with which he disagreed. Though, of course, we respect the judgment of the Supreme Court. On the second point, are we about the Ben Burt Act? I will say what I'm sure he understands. We will, of course, obey the law, and we will come out of the EU on October the 31st. On his point about preparations for a no-deal Brexit, I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who just spoke for 2 hours on this matter. Our preparations are very far advanced, and I think this country can be entirely confident that we will be ready, deal or no deal. On his point about whether we are on the verge of getting a deal or not, well, it is absolutely true that negotiations are difficult, but we are making progress. And all I will say to him and to his friends is that they have not been made easier by the Surrender Act that he passed. And I am very proud, by the way, to take his next point, about everything that I did as Mayor of London. I may say to the current Mayor that he'd be better off spending less on press officers and more on police officers in London, because we were funding 20,000 more on our streets. And as for being trusted on Iran, Mr. Speaker, this is a man who took the shilling of the mullahs from Press TV. Mr. Speaker, I think there's something. I was rather sad, actually, in a way, that the Labour conference was interrupted by the ruling, because I was awestruck by some of the things I heard, doubtless designed to obscure the inanity of his policy over Brexit. He wants to abolish fee-paying schools at a cost of £7 billion to the taxpayer. He wants a 4-day working week, cutting the incomes of the lowest paid in this country. He wants to abolish Ofsted, and now we hear he wants to abolish all immigration controls from the EU. But there was a crucial passage missing from his speech, it turns out, Mr. Speaker. I think there's something slightly pitiful, in a way, about the right honourable gentleman. It seems that he actually did want to call an election now, Mr. Speaker. There was a passage in his speech calling for an election now, but it was censored by the Stasi in the form of the Shadow Chancellor. Or possibly it was the Shadow Lord Chancellor. Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is being gagged. He's being muzzled. He's being held captive by his colleagues. They won't let him say what he wants to say. I say, free the Islington One, Mr. Speaker. And why won't they allow him to have an election, Mr. Speaker? Why won't they allow him to unleash his charms on the electorate? It's because they're not only terrified that he's going to lose, but also even more terrified by the remote possibility that he might win. He can't control his own party. He can't decide whether he's for Leave or for Remain. He's being held captive by his colleagues. The electorate are being held captive by this zombie parliament and this zombie opposition, and he wants the entire country to be held captive in the EU after October the 31st at a cost of more than £1 billion a month. We say no. I say no. Let's get Brexit done and let's take this country forward.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister?
Order! 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 I appeal to members of the House to calm themselves. I've just called the right honourable gentleman, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. He is entitled to put his question, and the rest of us are entitled to hear him. Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his very good put down of the shallow leader of the opposition? Can I also say that I understand now that his government has changed the root origin of the term yellowhammer to describe the botched attempt by the leader of the opposition to dispatch his own deputy. And could I ask him, I received and saw in my constituency, as others did recently, leaflets from the Labour Party calling for a general election now. Could he answer me this question? Can he give me any reason why we are not having an election at this particular point? Does he think for any moment it could be because the leader of the opposition fears his own party just as much as he fears us?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his very acute question, Mr. Speaker, and I'm afraid the answer is very simple, that they don't want an election because they are not sure that the public would trust them with the government of this country, and I think that they're right, and I think that they put the yellow into yellowhammer, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance copy of his statement? I have to say, when I read the first paragraph, and it talks about the Supreme Court verdict, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't the Supreme Court verdict, it was the judgment of the Supreme Court. And perhaps the Prime Minister might start to show some respect for the judiciary. You know, we're here today because the Prime Minister was utterly humiliated by the Supreme Court by a count of 11-0. And you might have thought in that diatribe that we had that we might have had some humility, that we might have been able to acknowledge that what we've had is the unlawful shutting down of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, sorry is indeed the hardest word for the Prime Minister. You know, it was said by a former Prime Minister, where law ends, tyranny begins. And Mr. Speaker, while it pains me to say it, the fact the Prime Minister is still standing here today, he in fact does believe he is above the law. Well, Mr. Speaker, he is not. And thank heavens for the action that was brought in the courts in Scotland and England. And I want to pay tribute to my honourable friend for Edinburgh South West. And thank goodness the courts have done their job and made sure that parliamentarians are back where they should be, in this House, holding the government to court. The ruling of the Supreme Court has made it absolutely crystal clear. The actions of this government, this Prime Minister, led to the unlawful prorogation of Parliament. Delivering the verdict, Lady Hale stated that prorogation was null and void. Have you no shame, Prime Minister? Mr. Speaker, the court concluded that the decision was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. Mr. Speaker, without reasonable justification. And the Prime Minister talks about us running off to the courts. Well, we got the courts to do what he failed to do, which was to respect parliamentary sovereignty. Frustrating, preventing Parliament carrying out its constitutional duties without reasonable justification. How devastating for a Prime Minister to have such a judgment. Where law ends, tyranny begins.